All right. So, Karl, that was, we had a little fun. We had a little interesting start to the webinar that we had planned today. So, for all of the people that registered for the event and were having trouble getting in to go to webinar, like myself and Karl were as well, we have pivoted and switched over to Teams. And so we're going to record this in Teams. And then I know we're getting an email out to everybody right now. And then as soon as we're done with this, we'll get it all put together and sent out in an email link. So apologize for the technical difficulty that we were having with GoToWebinar today. But hey, we'll adapt. We'll get through it and we'll still get the information out. Right, Karl?
I'm not convinced that we aren't getting attacked by Russia or Ukraine right now, that they don't want us to get this information out there. This is crazy. It's so funny because we've been logged into the system. We've done this many times. What an unfortunate timing for suddenly it to not work. So sorry about that, everybody. But we know you want the content. We know you're interested in knowing how this relates and what you need to do about it. And so we're here to share the content however we can. So bear with us. But we hope us sending it to you through this method works for you. And please, at any time, feel free to reach out to us to ask any questions that you might have asked during the webinar or any follow-up conversations you're looking for.
All right. So with that, let's get rolling. Let's dive into this and take a look at this. So, all right. Whew. Karl, lots going on with this. Pretty historic time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, there have been wars before, and Russia attacking, things in the United States or even in Ukraine is nothing new. But this is historic because this is the first time there's been all-out war that's had a significant cyber component operating simultaneously with actual bombs and missiles and troops and all sorts of other things going on. And that's really an interesting and different dynamic that we have never seen before. This is historic in a bad way, but nonetheless something of worth to take note, how this has changed the way that attacks are happening and what the implications for people in the United States and other parts of the world also are going to have to deal with as this has shifted now.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that cyber is now an actual component of a war battlefield.
Yeah, it's as we're seeing, it's effective. It's slowing things down. It's causing problems. Yeah. Logistic things are not working, and it is very much affecting how the troops are being deployed and how people are fleeing and the systems and tools that countries use in war and their efficiency or effectiveness. It's both horrifying and fascinating.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. So let's dive in. I know we've got a lot of content that we want to get out. So let's jump right in. We'll start talking a little bit about some of the vulnerabilities and some of the things like that we've kind of seen. Definitely an uptick in the last kind of 12 months. What's your kind of take on what we're seeing in the defense industrial base?
Well, remember the defense industrial base is any organization that's somewhere in the supply chain that provides government support, a government entity, or works on government contracts that might be coming into contact with classified information or perhaps controlled unclassified information or even federal contract information. And a lot of these folks are probably already thinking about things like the CMMC certification that's been brewing for a while and the NIST controls that have been, the law of the land since 2016. There's a lot going on in that base, but this information is applicable to any organization, but certainly those that focus in the defense industrial base. And as there have been studies going on, the amount of vulnerabilities being found and in software and accessing utilities out there is a much bigger issue than I think a lot of people realize. I mean, a lot of these companies are small businesses that may or may not even have an IT person on staff, let alone a cybersecurity expert prepared to defend against the thousands of attack packets that might come their way on a daily basis, which basically happens to everybody on the internet in some form or another right now. But the reality of it is if a vulnerability can be found and there's an exploit, it can lead to much worse things like gaining access to network, gaining access to data, and then all the things that happen with that. So things like remote code execution, meaning they can run a program in your network to further make things bad for you. Elevation of privileges, getting in under one account and then getting administrative authority so they can then go and wreak havoc. Now, these techniques have been around for a while, but we're seeing more and more vulnerabilities. Almost 1,000 since this pilot has been launched to look at this. And there is a huge database of historic ones as well. And these are all leading to the type of attacks that we're seeing coming in active today. So there are literally thousands of these, and we are needing the ability to protect against them.
Yeah. So this next slide to me is really interesting. So we laid this out because I think there's some pretty cool data points in here, and just wanted you guys to see from a timeline kind of perspective, just kind of what started happening back in February and kind of the different things that happened through February and March, and there's probably some updated April activity that I know has been going on that, sorry we don't have that kind of updated in this timeline, but we've got the full report in this MSP alert, so you can go out there and find this timeline pretty readily available. Are there a couple of things that stand out in this timeline for you, Karl? I know there was a couple for me.
Well, I think the key thing to note here is that we're seeing a trend. Well-known, long-established hacking groups that have claimed to be separate, not related to government entities, are taking sides. And so there's a couple of things you can apply for this. Maybe they are not as independent. Maybe they are more government-sponsored than maybe previously they were representing. And these are the hacking groups that have been doing the ransomware attacks for years, many of them, or new versions of them. And so as you look through this, you're seeing malware being deployed through these known hacking established organizations that is directly meant to wreak havoc and cause destruction. And so, it starts with, targeting Ukrainian enterprises. Air traffic control was one of the first ones that they went after. The Ukrainian government has actually openly asked for hacking volunteers now. I think that's the one, on March 3rd? Where, and we're seeing things attack like railway systems, air traffic control, government banking systems, all forms of communication, broadband, internet, all being attacked and brought down by various hacking groups, taking sides. Some, like for instance, the Conti group has kind of thrown in with the Russian government, and that's a long-established hacking group. So we're seeing various activities happening with cyber guerrilla warfare and a lot of interesting elements of where this is causing things like refugees to not be able to leave the country because the IT systems that were letting people out of the border that were being operated by the soldiers at the border were hacked and brought down. So they had to do things by hand. Everything, they're slowing things down. They're causing logistic problems. They're causing communication failures. It's incredible the things that we're seeing here.
Yeah, well, that was a couple of, you touched on a couple of the ones that I was thinking about too. Like when we first saw this new wiper malware starting to be deployed, and I know we've got a slide in a minute. We'll talk about that, but that was pretty significant. You touched on the Ukraine asking for an IT army, a volunteer of cyber warriors to help fight the fight was. Pretty interesting, topic to kind of read about. And then a couple of the other ones just around broadband attacks and some of the satellite communication things that were able to, that were compromised were pretty interesting. And I know in a minute we're going to dive into a couple of these and then talk specifically about some of the CMMC controls that you can put in place to kind of help protect your organization against these and other types of attacks. So speaking of, Why don't we jump right into that unless you got one more comment?
Well, I got one more comment. So I think the thing to note about this is what this means is we're bringing up some specific examples that mostly deal with Russia and Ukraine and how they're attacking each other. And what a playground this is for hackers to be able to basically have mental and moral and even government support to like legitimately seeing what they can blow up. That's usually a more metaphorical phrase, right?
Yeah.
But I think the other thing to note about this is geopolitical at a level that is different as well. I mean, China's weighing in on the Russian side. The U.S. is weighing in more on the Ukrainian side, and this is causing some greater geopolitical things happening. And so we're seeing not only attacks to Ukraine from Russia, but we're seeing attacks to American defense industrial base, and we're seeing things coming from China. And so there's this greater spread. It's further than just Russia and Ukraine attacking each other, because there are known allies for these organizations, at least at some level, that are basically throwing in with a side and participating in the cyber side, even if they're not putting troops on the field. And it seems to be very active,
Yep, great point. Great point. So, speaking of some of these attacks, this first slide that we kind of have here, it's not about the money, it's about destruction.
That's a huge shift,
right? So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and kind of what we mean? I think we've got some examples here of some of the recent named kind of wiper attacks that we're seeing.
Yeah, it must be fun to be the person that names these attacks, I suppose, to try to make them sound as cool as they can. But Drive Slayer and Hermetic Wiper, Whispergate. So here's the shift. For the longest time, hackers would gain access to your network. They would roll around, learn the lay of the land, get as much intel as they can, figure out the systems, figure out where all the gold is in the data in the network. And then they would execute some kind of concerted attack to encrypt files. But nonetheless, the file's still there and potentially recoverable. You would just have to pay a ransom, which is, of course, no fun whatsoever. But there is still this chance that you could still maybe get your data back, even if you had to pay the ransom. Whereas this is now just outright destruction. There's no attempt to even collect the ransom. It's just how quickly can they destroy important, useful data to disable your ability to leverage it or use it, and that you lose that information that may have been critical for some function or feature or research or whatever it may be. So these attacks that are coming are now very different. This is just flat out wiping drives empty and making the data non-recoverable.
So I heard an interesting story of where the Hermetic name came from. I don't know if you know this or not, or if you have read this, but it actually came from, there's a company called Hermetic Digital that's owned by a 24-year-old video game designer in Cyprus who runs his server out of his house. His server got compromised and they used the digital certificate from his server and code to digitally sign their malware.
Yeah, making it more likely to pass by a antivirus software or other types of detection, because once something's digitally signed, it doesn't look as dangerous as maybe it could actually be, right? That's I hadn't heard that, but I know that's been part of our research. I didn't until we did this, but there's anybody could be involved willingly or unwillingly, I suppose, when these kind of things come up.
Yeah, this what was reported is this person had just no idea that his server had been used in this kind of new wiper kind of malware. So
right.
So we know about these things similar to ransomware, but they're not after the money. They're after the destruction, trying to wipe out those machines. I know we've got some controls that we're going to talk about how we can protect ourselves from this style of malware, wiper or ransomware. And so let's jump into some specific, kind of NIST 800-171 controls that specifically relate to this type of attack. So you want to kind of step through a couple of these. Yeah. I won't make you read all of the information off of it, but maybe just hit on a couple of highlights for us.
Yeah, I will. I mean, first, I'd like to just set the stage for why we're taking this approach in this webinar. I think the biggest thing is like it's one thing to talk about what's going on, and and it's interesting, but at some level, you got to put this into a practical space where, like, okay, what is it that I need to do about this? And we thought a great approach to sharing what you should do about this would be based on controls that you probably already should be implementing if you're in the defense industrial base, which we think a lot of the folks signing up for this, these are folks that already should be thinking about CMMC. And these are existing controls in that system that are meant to help you protect against these. And by the way, these particular controls are ones that we see as particularly useful against the type of attacks happening now, based on this changing landscape of the threats, right? And so things like awareness training, helping your end users understand and prevent a social engineering attack, which could be a voicemail, it could be a phone call, it could be somebody walking in your door, it could be an email. A phishing email is a really common way that's done. But training your users on awareness is an essential component. And I think the other one that I think a lot of folks are still unaware of is a technology called application control, which is part of the new buzzword we're seeing in the industry called the zero trust architecture. And I think the key element to this is just understanding that if you implement application control, which until only recently has been fully impractical for a small business, and is now there are now new vendors and tools available. There's several that we've been working with for a couple of years in their very early stages now to coming into their own. But if you implement application control, it has the ability to change your computer so that it will not execute any file that isn't expressly approved, which means if a file gets modified or changed or something new gets sent to your system, even if it's a script or an executable or something that's trying to get in to destroy things, that program or that script or that executable, that DLL file cannot run if this application control is installed. Now, application control does require overhead and management because that means you have to approve everything you want to run. And so there's work in managing it, but it is the new form of protection, a new way to put up a wall so things that have never been seen before, that have never been caught by an antivirus before, that might look like total normal behavior, like a signed certificate from a known vendor, can't run unless it's been analyzed and been marked approved. So that, to me, those are some of the key elements here. Is if you haven't thought of application control yet for your business, we highly recommend you look into this or reach out to us to help you understand ways that we're seeing this be effective for the type of attacks, because this is a great way to prevent a destruction or a ransomware event.
Yeah, and let me just kind of add on to that just a little bit. By no means are we also saying that these are the only controls that relate to this. We just picked out a couple of ones that we thought were some important ones that kind of directly related. There are other, if I had kind of put all the controls in these slides that would help protect against a ransomware or a wiper, you guys, would need a magnifying glass to see the text in the slide. So by no means is this a complete list. Just wanted to point that out. The other kind of thing to kind of think about when you think about application control is, a Windows PC by default is designed to allow any software to install, right? And the whole notion of application control is to flip that script and deny everything from installing unless you've explicitly approved it.
Right. By default, it trusts any file that's sent to it. And so you change it so it trusts nothing and only allows what it specifically has been instructed to. But these other controls are great too. I mean, restricting admin access with the privilege control, communication for attacks on the system and information integrity. These are some great controls. These are ones that I think specifically would help against what we're seeing now. There are many other things that need to be done. This is not a quick fix, but it's a great place to get started and perhaps a way to prioritize controls you might look to implement.
Sure. Okay, so let's jump over and talk about our next one that was kind of directly related that we saw to some of the Russian and Ukraine attacks. And those were just around vulnerabilities and vulnerability scans. I know for us, in our practice, we see these types of scans, hitting customer firewalls all the
Thousands,
time, all
thousands
over
a
the
day,
place,
every customer. Yep.
all the time, So why don't you dive in and tell us a little bit about just some of the things that we're seeing with some of the vulnerability scans, and then again, this is not a complete list of controls. We just picked out, a couple that we thought were just good for this kind of conversation. So,
Yeah.
what you got for us?
Well, okay. So look, I think a lot of people have been aware, at least at some level, that you put yourself out on the internet, somebody might come at you. Some of them may not realize that a lot of this is compromised or just hacking controlled systems that are just scanning anything that comes on the internet and constantly checking for vulnerabilities to see if it's there. And if you don't have that thing patched or that configuration blocked or that vulnerability remediated, it could find it and then begin the process of exploiting it to gain access. So there's this constant scanning going on that is intense. It's a significant percentage of traffic on the internet, and nobody is immune to that scanning coming at them looking for vulnerabilities. It happens always and instantly as soon as systems are on the internet. The controls we're talking about here are ways that you can better understand what vulnerabilities might be found by a scanner, hence the risk assessment controls. And then the ones around system communication protection, system integrity is about configuring them securely and putting systems in place that can log and detect things that might be going wrong. And sometimes it's as simple as, hey, I went to my firewall and I said, I don't want to allow any traffic from Russia into my network. So block anything from Russia, block anything from North Korea, block anything from China. That's called geocode. Geo IP fencing or country code blocking. And that's a great place to start. It doesn't fully prevent people from those locations of finding a way to get to, but it does slow down a lot of these automated scanners that are looking for the low hanging fruit. And so there's just several steps you can take out of these vulnerabilities about scanning. So you know what vulnerabilities you have, you're scanning yourself. So you know what they might see when they scan, and then doing some things around configuration to make your footprint or what can be seen about you much smaller and harder to find.
Yeah, excellent. Good advice there. All right, well, let's move on to our next one, which, we kind of used this graphic because there was some Russian satellite systems and infrastructure that got kind of compromised on that timeline. And so, tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the controls there.
Well, even here in the United States, some of us might remember like the gas pipeline in the southeast 2 years ago, right? That was compromised by similar kind of concept. Is satellites are run by these same kind of networks as your computers are, and as well as railway systems and telecom systems. And so these are vulnerable in the same way, and relate to however well they're managed or not well managed. And the reality of it is a lot of folks, I think probably maybe the first thing to understand here is a lot of folks think that if they rely on protecting their network, this is like locking your door. If I lock my door, nobody ever gets in. But the reality of it is most time when people are burglarizing a building or a home, the door was locked, but they still found their way in. And that's how it works with systems as well. And so that's why we're talking about the managed detection and response solution. A lot of folks have recognized and realized that this is really something that if you don't have now, you should be doing right away. It's been a standard for a couple of years now, but you need to not only protect yourself, but also be able to detect what has gone on. So many of us not just lock our doors, but we have alarm systems and camera systems that tell us when people get in. And that's reality. What happens is hackers may find their way in a way that your protection didn't work. Maybe they are able to log in like an employee because that employee gave up some information through social engineering, like in a phone call, they gave away username and password, or they gave up other access, or they find a vulnerability that gets them in the door. The reality of it is they get in the door. But a lot of times there's time between the time they get in the door and the time they launch the attack. This is called dwell time, where they can be detected, and you could potentially stop the attack before they execute it while they're in that dwell time phase. And that is the benefit of using endpoint protection or a MDR or an endpoint protection or a protection and detection system like an MDR solution. And so you'll see, like this year on insurance form, they're asking if you're using EDR or MDR solutions. This is all about not just protection locking your door, but also detection of people going around in your network or in your cloud systems so that you could potentially stop them and kick them out before they actually execute their attack once they're in the door. Because locking your door is not good enough. They get through doorways all the time.
Yeah, it reminds me of a just, I like stories. Hopefully everybody else likes stories. So I got a little story for you. A couple of years ago, we started working with a client and detected just by, honestly, by luck. We had one of our engineers looking through some log stuff and was like, something doesn't look right here. What we ended up finding was a person got tricked by a phishing email, installed some software on their machine that gave an attacker command and control access into the environment. They were able to kind of laterally move through the environment using SMB shares, stole and harvested admin credentials, which is what our engineer kind of spotted was his own login account was trying to be used, and we was seeing a bunch of failed logins inside the environment for it. Long story short, but you're right, if an MDR solution was in place where we were able to not only do some SIM logging and log some of the log files to be able to detect some of that stuff, but also monitoring the network traffic, looking for those kinds of PowerShell commands and things that we would typically use to do automation and management in an environment, they were using for nefarious activity as they looked around and looked for information. A solution like an MDR solution helps kind of protect and detect that type of movement and activity in the environment.
Well, the other half of that story too is, and by the way, it might be worth saying, we were still onboarding this customer, and that attacker, I think when it's all said and done, we'd figured out had been there for something like 6 months before we ever became involved with this customer, had been dwelling in there, stealing data for a long time. And we happened to catch it manually while we were still putting security systems in place. By the time we got our MDR solution in place, it instantly triggered this activity. We could see every system that was having, we saw it would spread. Like I remember when we began the process of fighting the remediation, as we tell stories, right? We started protecting home turf and on the servers, but I remember a user that would have an infected system would be out on a VPN and they haven't connected for 3 days and they'd reconnect and that system would try to reinitiate the attack. And thank heavens we had the MDR solution in place that told us every time that happened, because there were actually thousands of users involved in this scenario and a lot of people at a lot of locations and a lot of systems at a lot of locations. And, if you eradicate it from 95% of the systems, that 5% can just bring it all right back again. So it's quite the process. And without the detection ability, we would have never been able to find all the places it was and to eradicate it from their environment. It's an incredible thing. It's not only important to try to see if you can't catch them in dwell time to prevent the big attack. It also is very helpful if you have to, if you've been attacked, to try to figure out if you've actually got rid of them, which is a big part of that instant response process.
Yeah. So speaking of, let's talk about some controls and what we can do to kind of protect ourselves from that kind of attack. So what you got for us?
Okay, well, so access control, these first couple are pretty simple. You need to have monitoring or logging of how people can log in and limiting that when they log in, what they can do. Some networks, for instance, when somebody logs in, they have local administrative authority. So they could go and install a piece of software, maybe a piece of software they need for their job, or their IT person can just walk up and do it. The problem with that is that means that person could also install a piece of some bad software or introduce a hacker into the environment. And so one of the ways you can really slow them down is nobody is using privileged or admin accounts except when they're doing admin specific actions. And the rest of the time they log in on lesser authority accounts. and restricting authentication to only authorized users and authorized devices. These are some critical pieces. Another thing is look, if you haven't gotten involved in multi-factor authentication for logging in, you are just asking for your passwords to be cracked. It is so much easier than it used to be. And so your email systems, remote control, VPN, ZTNA, zero trust networking access, or logging into any sensitive system should have, especially with administrative account, should have multi-factor authentication, so that not only do you have to know the username and the password, but you also have to authenticate in some other way, like you have an app that gives you a control code that you type in separately, or a fingerprint or a retinal scan. There's lots of ways it can be done for the second factor, but multi-factor is critical.
Yeah.
I think the last one there, pointing out that there are controls that an MDR solution fits. And so we just point out, whether you call us up and find out about the MDR solution that SnapTech works with, or you find another vendor, you should be using MDR in your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So how about a holistic approach? I know we've kind of taken the NIST cybersecurity framework and kind of adjusted it a little bit and added a little spot there. But just talk to us a little bit about kind of a holistic approach to cybersecurity and compliance and how we approach that market.
Yeah, you bet. This is here at SnapTech IT, we've been paying attention to this space for several years, and we really like the work that NIST has done as far as way of organizing and ensuring you're managing your IT in a very comprehensive way, and it helps you manage your cybersecurity defense and your cyber resilience in a significant way. And so that's based on 5 categories that you have to be able to identify everything on your network, be able to audit and assess. You have to protect. Lock that door like we talked about, have antivirus in place, restrict your firewalls, have a good backup system in place, put application control in place. But then also you need to have things in detection, like the MDR solutions we've been talking about. And it's very important that you plan for how to respond to an incident, and that you know the how and the best way to recover from an incident. So those are the 5 categories that NIST has for its controls, which plays directly into the CMMC certification as well. And then we add in IT management in general as a last category, a 6th category, because we think that day-to-day management needs to be considered in the grand scheme of things as well. And there needed to be a category for that. So this is our interpretation of how we go to market, that we want to look at every customer from the perspective of, do we have identified correct? Do we have all the right protections? Do we have detections? Do we know how to respond? Do we know how to recover? And is the ongoing management facilitating highly effective, cost-efficient IT solutions? And so that's that's our point of view on how we approach the market.
Yeah, great. Good job explaining that. This next section is a little awkward since GoToWebinar didn't quite work for us, and we're having to record this and send it out. So I don't have my normal pop-up screen with some attendee questions in it, unfortunately. But what we will do is when we send this out, we'll send it out to you guys in email. If you do have any questions, just feel free to shoot those back in an email to us, and we'll get answers to you, just as soon as we can. Or if you're so inclined, pick up a phone and give us a call. We're always happy to chat and get a little nerdy sometimes and talk cyber and talk IT and.
Yeah, no obligation. We're happy to answer questions. It's a great way to get our contact, or just to see other material we provided, or other webinar recordings we've done, or just more information about how to plan for your cybersecurity defense and IT systems. SnapTechIT.com. There's a nice resource page on there. There's a contact us page. Reach out to us. We're pretty responsive, and we're happy to, no obligation, just to answer questions and see if we can be helpful.
Yeah. Speaking of, and I'll flip over to this. I can't promise that the May and June webinars are going to be on GoToWebinar. Might be a different platform by then. Might be doing it over Teams. We'll see. But we do have a great May webinar and June webinar planned. May we're going to dive in and talk some MDR solution and do some education around MDR and kind of what that means and how that kind of works, and give you some examples and some customer input and point of view on that. And then in June, we're going to do the same thing and talk about application control. So those are two exciting ones that I think we've got coming up. Again, not sure the platform that we'll be on at that point, but we're excited about doing these upcoming webinars. So,
well, yeah, and I can say a couple of things about this. One is based on the type of attacks we're seeing in the messaging, you should be curious about MDR. You should be curious about application control. That's one of the reasons why we thought that would be the great next topic, is to dig into those specifically, because the other piece of this that isn't being said is very few companies, particularly in the small business area of the defense industrial base, have either of these in place. This is almost total white space of nobody has either of these in place. And it is past the point in time where that's a responsible approach. It's something that, it would be wise risk mediation for you to consider implementing the controls we talked about. They link directly to the type of attacks that are happening and active today. And these are the best ways to prevent them and reduce the risk of your business and ensure productive, efficient operations at the highest performance you can going forward.
Awesome. And then, you already mentioned it, but we do have a resource section on our website. Check that out. There's other webinars and other events and other content that we have, just educational in nature, that we put out there. So any last parting words or comments?
No, look, I think the last thing to say is, look, our hearts go out to the people affected by this terrible action that's happening. And it doesn't escape us that this is both amazing and horrifying. And so our hearts go out and our prayers and thoughts go out to the people being affected by this war. And it is very enlightening to consider how now cyber attacks play into this open aggression. And to be perfectly frank, even if there was an all-out open war in the world, these cyber attacks have been floating around for a long time. And it is part of our duty as citizens to do what we can to protect our defense industrial base, to protect our economy, to do what we can. But it's also helps us protect our own businesses and our own livelihoods. And that's what I'm here for. I want to protect mine and for us and our employees, and I want to help our customers protect theirs and reduce their risk as well. So our hearts go out to them, and we look forward to seeing who we can help in reducing their risk.
Excellent. Very well put. So with that, I guess until next time, we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.